This explainer is provided by ChemicalSafety and Engineering.
We'll be unpacking exactly how a modern, regulated facility could fail so completely, specifically looking at the massive failure to properly manage changes, the illegal storage of highly hazardous materials, and the deliberate circumvention of safety regulations. So let's just dive right in.
Right off the bat, we really have to grasp the sheer devastating scale of this blast. 450 tons. That is the TNT equivalent of the explosions that ripped through the Ruhai hazardous goods warehouse that night. I mean, it was literally so powerful that it registered on earthquake monitors. But to truly understand how a disaster like this happens, we need to wind the clock back and figure out how those 450 tons of explosive force were even allowed to gather in one place.
Now, the human cost here was just staggering. 165 people lost their lives. And what makes this especially tragic and absolutely crucial to understanding how hazard information was mismanaged here is that this number includes 99 firefighters. These first responders showed up to the scene completely blind to the danger. They honestly thought they were fighting a standard fire, not standing at ground zero of a massive chemical detonation.
Which brings us to the big question, right? How does a modern, heavily regulated industrial port just suddenly detonate? China had actually beefed up its industrial safety laws a lot since the early 2000s. The laws were on the books, the frameworks were clearly written out. So to figure out how they failed so spectacularly, we have to look past the final spark that set it off.
Think of it like this. Imagine your layers of defense are slices of Swiss cheese. A massive disaster doesn't usually happen because of one single mistake. It happens when the holes, the weaknesses in operations, management, and oversight, all align perfectly, letting the threat pass straight through to cause a catastrophe. So let's look at the first slice of that cheese: physical and chemical failures. The chemical chain reaction here is pretty shocking. Step 1. The warehouse was storing nitrocellulose, which is highly flammable, but the packaging was a total failure. It wasn't sealed in plastic film like it was supposed to be, so its damping agent evaporated and it just dried out. Step 2. On August 12th, the ambient temperature hit 36 degrees Celsius. Inside those unventilated containers, it essentially baked until it spontaneously combusted. And step 3, because the chemicals were stored in total chaos with barely any space between them, the fire easily jumped to nearby containers of ammonium nitrate.
Moving on to the second slice, operational circumvention.
You won't believe the illegal storage quantities we're talking about here. They exceeded limits by just staggering margins. Ruhai was storing potassium nitrate at over 53 times the legal limit, sodium cyanide at 42 times the limit, sodium sulfide at almost 20 times the limit. And on the day of the blast, they had 800 tons of ammonium nitrate just sitting in a delivery zone illegally. This was for sure not some minor paperwork error. This was a wholesale, deliberate bypassing of the rules.
Because of this massive failure to manage changes, the whole system was essentially operating blind. I mean, Ruhai built their yard before even getting approvals. They operated without proper permits for long stretches. But most critically, they completely failed to register the major hazard materials they had on site. So when the fire broke out, they had no mutual protection agreements with neighbors, and emergency crews were given zero heads up about the chemicals inside.
Tracing the timeline from that night really shows how fast these failures spiraled out of control. At 22:51, the fire's reported. 5 minutes later, firefighters arrive, completely unaware they're walking into a chemical stockpile. Lacking that hazard info, they try cooling the area with water, which can actually be incredibly dangerous depending on the chemicals involved. By 23:34, the first blast hits with the force of 15 tons of TNT. Just 30 seconds later, the immense heat and shockwave trigger a second, catastrophic blast, 430 tons of TNT.
This brings us to our third slice: institutional and regulatory collapse.
The analysis points out a wild contrast between the safety laws that existed and what was actually enforced. The Tianjin Transport Committee illegally approved operations and handed out permits. The Tianjin Port Group outright falsified safety documents and completely ignored the limits of their own fire brigade. And Tianjin Customs allowed Ruhai to handle hazardous goods way outside their legal scope. Across the board, these regulatory bodies willfully turned a blind eye.
But it wasn't just government regulators. Intermediary technical agencies failed spectacularly too. According to the investigation, the very independent groups supposed to ensure safety were actively covering up non-compliance. They faked safety assessments. They approved designs that flagrantly ignored zoning laws, placing a ticking time bomb far too close to residential areas and transit routes. They literally hid hazardous materials on the original site plans just to push the approvals through.
Now, let's look at the global supply chain shockwaves.
Obviously, the local destruction was apocalyptic. 304 buildings destroyed, over 12,000 cars incinerated in their lots. But globally, the disruption was immediate. GlaxoSmithKline entirely lost production capacity for a crucial hepatitis B drug because their site was right near the blast. Automotive giants like Toyota and Volkswagen and agricultural leaders like John Deere took massive material hits. It really just proves that an isolated regulatory failure at a key node like Tianjin instantly paralyzes global networks.
Which leads us to lessons for emerging economies.
So what are the systemic fixes we need to take away from this? Well, first off, just having laws isn't enough. You absolutely need strict, independent oversight of the agencies enforcing them. Second, we desperately need a unified national hazard information platform so emergency services are never walking in blind again. Third, first responders need specialized chemical emergency training. Standard firefighting tactics aren't going to cut it. And lastly, community risk planning has to be integrated, making sure hazardous zones keep safe distances from the public.
So, I'll leave you with this to chew on. As our global supply chains get more and more complex, and we rely heavier on these massive industrial hubs, are we truly building resilient, layered defenses? Or are we somewhere out there right now just waiting for the holes in the Swiss cheese to align once again? Definitely something to think about for your own risk management strategies.